I have spent a long life observing how people think, decide, and allocate their resources. Over decades, patterns emerge, and the lessons they reveal are rarely flashy or sensational. The difficulties people face are almost never due to extraordinary complexity or bad luck. Instead, they stem from simple, predictable mistakes, errors that could have been avoided with just a little patience, discipline, and reflection. Over time, I have realized that human behavior follows repeatable rules, particularly in areas like money management, personal security, and decision-making. People constantly make assumptions that seem logical in the moment, but prove costly in the long run. They assume that sharing information freely is inherently virtuous, that cleverness can replace caution, or that the intentions of others will align with their own. These assumptions are comfortable, even appealing, but they are dangerous. The human mind is a double-edged sword. It is capable of extraordinary insight, but is equally prone to predictable biases, envy, overconfidence, impatience, and a chronic underestimation of compounding effects over time. Most of life's difficulties are not caused by dramatic shocks. They grow quietly from a series of small, avoidable errors. People repeatedly give away leverage, optionality, and control, often without recognizing the long-term consequences. Observing this over decades has taught me lessons that are not theoretical. They are distilled from watching both the triumphs and failures of others. They are quiet warnings about how life punishes lapses in judgment, disclosure, and foresight. At the core of these lessons is one principle that underpins everything else I have learned: avoiding stupidity matters more than demonstrating cleverness. Avoiding stupidity matters more than demonstrating cleverness. If there is one insight I wish more people understood earlier in life, it is this: success rarely comes from extraordinary brilliance. It more often comes from consistently avoiding obvious mistakes. I have known many brilliant people whose outcomes were worse than mine. Their intelligence did not fail them. Their repeated, unforced errors did. Humans are naturally attracted to cleverness. Bold predictions, innovative strategies, and sophisticated reasoning draw attention and admiration. Yet life does not reward cleverness in isolation. It rewards durability, survival, and the ability to stay in the game long enough to see compounding work its magic. You do not need to be the fastest thinker or the most dazzling strategist. You need to avoid the traps that are visible to anyone paying attention. The biggest failures I have witnessed arise from ignoring basic realities. People borrow excessively when interest rates are low and optimism is high. They concentrate investments because confidence feels good. They enter partnerships without clear incentives because trust feels virtuous. None of these mistakes require a lack of intelligence. In fact, very intelligent individuals are often more vulnerable because they can rationalize poor decisions with elaborate reasoning. A useful approach is inversion. Instead of asking, "How do I become extremely successful?" ask, "How do people reliably ruin their lives?" The answers are remarkably consistent. Excessive leverage, untreated ego, impatience, envy, and the inability to admit error appear repeatedly as the root causes of failure. Avoid these, and you are already ahead of most of the population. I have spent decades observing the power of compounding in both directions. Small advantages, carefully protected, grow quietly over time. Small errors, repeated or left uncorrected, eventually become catastrophic. The difference between success and failure is not genius, it is discipline. Cleverness often encourages activity. Wisdom often encourages restraint. In investing, the person who does nothing when nothing intelligent can be done usually outperforms the one who constantly feels the need to demonstrate how smart they are. The same principle extends far beyond finance. The quiet avoidance of folly produces a life that may appear boring to outsiders, but functions extraordinarily well internally. If you remember only one lesson from this discussion, let it be this: the world is not fair, but it is fairly predictable in how it punishes foolish behavior. Stay in the game long enough, avoid the obvious errors, and time will do most of the work for you. Time is an ally for those who act prudently, a relentless adversary for those who do not. Information is leverage, and once it leaves your control, it cannot be reclaimed. One of the most misunderstood ideas today is that openness is always virtuous. Many people equate honesty with indiscretion, assuming that sharing information builds trust. In reality, it often shifts leverage in ways they do not understand. Once someone knows your financial position, intentions, or vulnerabilities, their behavior will adjust, not necessarily out of malice, but because human behavior naturally responds to new inputs. This is a fundamental principle of human nature, and ignoring it has cost many people opportunities, credibility, and peace of mind. I have seen countless people harm themselves by revealing too much too early. Employees who announce plans to leave months before departure suddenly find opportunities drying up. Individuals who share financial success attract envy, comparison, and expectations. Others reveal uncertainty or weakness and quietly lose credibility. None of these outcomes were intended, but all were predictable. The mistake is assuming others will process information the way you would. They will not. They process it through their own incentives, fears, and self-interest. This is why professionals exist. Lawyers, accountants, and advisors operate under structures designed to handle sensitive information responsibly. Casual acquaintances do not. Before sharing something personal or strategic, ask what advantage does the listener gain from knowing this. If the answer is unclear, the risk is almost certainly higher than the reward. This does not mean living a secretive or dishonest life. It means being deliberate. A well-run operation never broadcasts internal details to the public. Individuals should think the same way. Once information is released, control over it is permanently lost. Intelligent people respect irreversible decisions, whether in capital allocation or communication. Life is built on maintaining leverage, optionality, and flexibility. Careless disclosure erodes all three. Guard your information as you guard your time and capital. All of these are finite and none should be squandered casually. Incentives, not intentions, govern how people use the knowledge you provide. One of the most reliable lessons I have learned is that human behavior is far more predictable when studied through the lens of incentives rather than intentions. Most disappointment comes from assuming others will act out of kindness, loyalty, or fairness when incentives point elsewhere. Ignoring this reality is a guaranteed way to be surprised in unpleasant ways. I have observed this repeatedly in business, families, and friendships. A person shares financial information with a relative expecting discretion, only to behavior change subtly. Another shares plans with a colleague expecting support, only to encounter resistance. These outcomes occur not from malice, but because the knowledge changes expectations. Incentives shift, and behavior follows. The same principle applies in organizations. Disclose plans too early and opportunities diminish. Reveal weakness prematurely and trust erodes. Understanding the influence of incentives is the foundation of patience, discipline, and long-term success. One of the most underappreciated assets in life is optionality, the ability to choose, wait, and respond instead of being forced into a course of action. Optionality gives power to react thoughtfully rather than respond impulsively. But optionality is fragile. Every careless disclosure, every unconsidered word, every public commitment erodes it. Privacy is the shield that protects optionality, and it is far more valuable than most people realize. The simplest errors, like revealing a plan too early or sharing financial details unnecessarily, quietly reduce the range of choices available over time. Once optionality is lost, it is extraordinarily difficult to regain. Modern culture celebrates constant disclosure. Social media rewards announcing plans, opinions, and achievements. People are socially reinforced for visible productivity, for boldness, and for openness. Yet life does not reward visibility in the same way. Results, durability, and timing are what matter. Those who understand this distinction operate differently. They understand that privacy is not secrecy for its own sake. It is strategic restraint, a deliberate approach that allows them to observe, adapt, and act when conditions are favorable. There is a subtle psychological advantage to privacy. When you do not publicly declare your intentions, you remain free to change your mind. Plans evolve, conditions shift, market dynamics, personal circumstances, and new information require flexibility. The person who announces intentions prematurely binds themselves emotionally and socially. They create an invisible pressure to follow through, even if circumstances suggest another course of action. Flexibility is intelligence in motion, and privacy protects it. The inverse is equally true. Premature disclosure of plans, financial success, or vulnerabilities invites interference, comparison, and premature judgment. It signals certainty where none exists and removes the ability to adjust without consequence. Doors close quietly, often without explanation. Opportunities diminish. Relationships change. And in many cases, the person who shares too much is left wondering what went wrong. This is not about assuming malice. It is about observing the predictable ways human behavior responds to information. Money, in particular, is a delicate subject. Disclosing financial details is one of the fastest ways to invite comparison and dysfunction. Money is not just a medium of exchange, it is a status signal. When you reveal what you earn, what you own, or even what you lack, you trigger an unconscious measurement in others. They measure themselves against you, often resulting in envy, resentment, or misplaced expectations. Relationships that were functional suddenly become distorted. Advice is colored by comparison. Requests are filtered through expectation. Interaction is subtly but profoundly altered. I have observed this dynamic repeatedly. Families, friendships, and business networks all exhibit similar patterns. In families, one sibling's success can trigger insecurity in another, changing every interaction from that point forward. In organizations, circulating compensation or wealth details often shifts focus from creating value to measuring inequity. Productivity declines, morale erodes, rational behavior gives way to emotion. The lesson is obvious when viewed through the lens of inversion. Ask how people reliably damage functional relationships. Money disclosure is one of the fastest methods. This is not an argument for deception. Prudence is not dishonesty. It is an acknowledgement of human nature. You are not obliged to provide information that creates misaligned incentives or emotional friction. Long-term success, financial and personal, depends on preserving stable relationships and clear thinking. Comparison undermines both. The fewer unnecessary comparisons you invite, the smoother your path tends to be. I have never observed a life improved by public knowledge of one's wealth. I have seen countless lives complicated by it. That asymmetry alone is a powerful guide to behavior. Timing is another form of leverage often overlooked. Premature honesty about future plans destroys optionality and control. Many well-intentioned people announce their intentions too early, believing that transparency is virtuous. In reality, this often produces outcomes that are unnecessary and harmful. Timing matters. Revealing future plans before they are actionable is one of the fastest ways to surrender leverage unknowingly. Leverage is the ability to influence outcomes in your favor. Once others know your intended direction, they adjust behavior. Rarely does that adjustment improve your position. I have observed this in countless business and professional situations. Employees who announce a departure months in advance often find responsibilities altered, opportunities reduced, and trust subtly eroded. Not because the employer is vindictive, but because incentives have shifted. The person is no longer viewed as a long-term investment. Deals, negotiations, and personal commitments follow the same principle. Reveal urgency or dependence too early, and the terms worsen. What could have been optional becomes necessary, and necessity is the weakest negotiating position. The disciplined approach is sequence and control. Think privately, plan carefully, act decisively. Speak only when action no longer depends on permission, validation, or approval. Trust is valuable but fragile, particularly when incentives are misaligned. One of the costliest mistakes is confusing trust with alignment. People often place money, authority, or decision-making power in the hands of those they admire, or wish to trust, rather than ensuring incentives are structured to produce reliable outcomes. Character alone rarely guarantees consistent results. Misaligned incentives are not a moral failing, they are a design flaw. Systems should be structured so that ordinary human behavior produces acceptable outcomes without relying on exceptional virtue. This principle is as relevant to families as it is to corporations and governments. Resentment is another quiet compounding risk. When held privately, it may be manageable. When expressed without thought, it multiplies, distorting relationships and opportunities long after the original grievance. Words travel, interpretations shift, motives are questioned, and reputations suffer. Silence in this context is not suppression, but strategy. Emotional discipline preserves long-term advantage. Discretion is a skill, not a weakness. Not everyone deserves access to your vulnerabilities or your inner life. A repeated mistake is sharing personal struggles with those unequipped or unincentivized to handle them responsibly. Premature disclosure exposes one to judgment, altered behavior, and lost opportunities. Wisdom is knowing whom to confide in. Professionals or trusted advisors whose duty and competence ensure your vulnerabilities are managed responsibly. Protecting your inner life preserves freedom, flexibility, and optionality. Even small security lapses compound into irreversible damage over time. Modern life is a complex system that amplifies both diligence and error. A single careless act like sharing a password or sensitive access can cascade into losses far beyond immediate perception. Years of careful effort can be destroyed in moments of inattention. Discipline, structure, and redundancy are not optional, they are essential. Treat your digital, financial, and legal life with the same seriousness as your capital. Mistakes in these areas are permanent and costly. If there is a thread connecting these observations, it is this life is governed by the interplay of behavior, incentives, time, and the compounding effects of small decisions. Every choice, every word, every piece of information shared, and every opportunity pursued or ignored exists within this system. Rational thinking, patience, and disciplined observation of human nature allow a person to avoid the most costly mistakes. Understanding incentives helps anticipate how others act once they possess knowledge about you. Discretion preserves optionality, allowing decisions to be deferred until circumstances are favorable. Time amplifies both good and bad choices. Errors left uncorrected compound quietly but inexorably. Small, consistent prudence grows steadily but powerfully. Brilliance matters far less than avoiding obvious mistakes. Those who focus solely on cleverness often underestimate structural risks. Those who respect predictable human behavior understand the limits of trust, preserve privacy and security, and act with restraint, accumulate advantages over decades. These advantages may be invisible in the short term, but are decisive over a lifetime. If there is a single principle that governs nearly every successful outcome I have observed, it is this: information is leverage, and leverage is power. But leverage only matters when it is preserved, protected, and used wisely. Once information leaves your control, the advantages it provides dissipate, often irreversibly. Yet so many people treat knowledge casually. They share plans, intentions, and financial details as though disclosure is a virtue in itself. It is not. Thoughtless disclosure is one of the most consistent ways people erode control over their lives, relationships, and opportunities. I have spent decades watching people suffer predictable consequences from sharing too much too soon. A junior executive tells colleagues about a pending promotion and suddenly finds their workload shifted or opportunities reduced. A business owner reveals a strategic direction prematurely and competitors adjust before the plan is implemented. A family member shares financial success and faces envy, altered expectations, or subtle exclusion. None of these outcomes are malicious, yet they are entirely predictable. The lesson is simple: people respond to incentives, not intentions. Most disappointment and failure occur because individuals assume others will behave as they themselves would. We like to believe in kindness, loyalty, and fairness, yet human behavior is far more predictable when observed through the lens of incentives. People rarely act in ways that conflict with their own self-interest, consciously or unconsciously. Ignore this and you are inviting trouble. Observe it and you can anticipate behavior before it becomes a problem. I have repeatedly seen this in business, friendships, and families. Change the incentive and behavior changes immediately, often without conscious awareness. This principle underpins much of long-term strategy in investing in life. Understanding incentives is not simply a tool for prediction, it is a tool for design. Systems, relationships, and agreements should be constructed so that ordinary human behavior produces acceptable outcomes. Do not rely on exceptional virtue or goodwill. When incentives are aligned, trust is reinforced automatically. When they are misaligned, trust becomes a liability. I have rarely seen failure come from misunderstanding incentives intellectually. I have often seen it result from ignoring them emotionally, wanting to believe what we hope to be true rather than what is reliably true. Resisting that temptation requires discipline, patience, and experience. Equally important is the timing and control of information. Strategic restraint is not secrecy, it is awareness of the consequences of disclosure. Timing matters. Revealing intentions before they are actionable, disclosing weaknesses before they are mitigated, or announcing financial positions prematurely all shift leverage away from you. A well-structured life, personal or professional, is built around maintaining control over timing, sequence, and optionality. Think privately, act decisively. Speak only when action no longer depends on validation or permission. This principle applies to capital allocation, career moves, negotiations, and personal relationships. One of the most subtle but powerful consequences of losing control over information is the impact on incentives of others. When someone knows your plans, they may adjust their behavior in ways you did not anticipate. Opportunities that would have naturally arisen may diminish. Cooperation may decline. Trust may erode, not because anyone is ill-intentioned, but because human behavior adapts to new inputs. Incentives shift. The relationship changes. This phenomenon occurs everywhere: families, workplaces, financial markets, and friendships. Those who recognize it maintain discretion. Those who ignore it inadvertently give away their leverage. Optionality and flexibility are also consequences of disciplined information control. When you retain the ability to act privately, you can revise decisions as conditions evolve. Markets change, personal circumstances evolve, and new information emerges constantly. Flexibility allows you to adjust without social or psychological cost. Premature commitment, whether verbal or written, imposes invisible costs. The person who announces intentions too early binds themselves emotionally and strategically, reducing the ability to respond effectively. The disciplined approach is clear: protect your options, guard your privacy, and act only when circumstances are favorable. Another dimension of disciplined decision making is understand the difference between action and motion. Many people confuse being busy with being effective. Cleverness often drives action, projects, discussions, meetings, and constant decisions, while wisdom encourages restraint. The person who does nothing when nothing intelligent can be done often outperforms the one who constantly seeks to demonstrate capability. Activity without purpose erodes optionality and consumes resources. Restraint preserves them. A well-lived life, financially and personally, is rarely dramatic. It is quiet, measured, and deliberate. The same principle applies to wealth and resource management. I have observed countless instances where premature disclosure of financial information led to comparison, envy, and dysfunction. Money is more than a medium of exchange. It is a status signal. Once others know your financial position, expectations shift. Envy emerges, emotional dynamics change, often without conscious thought. Families fracture. Organizations become less productive and friendships are strained, all from predictable human reactions to status and comparison. The disciplined individual understands that prudence in disclosure is not dishonesty, it is protection. Discipline in this context also means designing environments to reduce the risk of error. Trust alone is insufficient. Align incentives wherever possible. Professionals, lawyers, accountants, advisors exist because structure matters. Their incentives are shaped by rules and consequences, ensuring that behavior aligns with desired outcomes. When structure is absent, hope alone is an unreliable guide. Align incentives first. Trust is a supplement, not a substitute. Resentment, when expressed without discipline, compounds silently but destructively. Small grievances, once spoken without care, ripple through networks, relationships, and opportunities. Interpretations distort, reputations are altered, and doors close quietly but permanently. Silence and emotional discipline are tools to preserve long-term advantage. Knowing when to speak and when to remain silent is a skill cultivated over decades. In digital and modern life, the stakes are even higher. One careless disclosure, like a password, sensitive access, or personal detail, can cascade into losses far larger than anticipated. Systems amplify both diligence and error. Redundancy, structure, and careful management of access are not optional. They are essential. Treat your digital, financial, and personal information with the same seriousness as capital. Losses in these domains are permanent, costly, and often irreversible. The thread connecting all these observations is the interplay between human behavior, incentives, time, and compounding consequences. Every choice, every conversation, every piece of information shared, and every opportunity pursued or ignored operates within this framework. Rational thought, patience, and careful observation of human nature allow one to avoid the most costly errors. Respect incentives, control information, preserve optionality, act when circumstances are favorable. These are the building blocks of long-term success. Over a lifetime, brilliance matters far less than avoiding mistakes. People focus solely on cleverness often underestimate structural risks. Those who respect human nature, maintain privacy, and exercise restraint consistently accumulate advantages. These advantages may appear invisible in the short term, but are decisive over decades. Life is rarely dramatic for those who succeed quietly. It is the accumulation of small, disciplined choices made with an understanding of human behavior and the predictable consequences of disclosure, trust, and timing. One of the most striking patterns I have observed over a long life is how small errors repeated over time compound into catastrophic consequences, while small, disciplined advantages quietly grow into extraordinary results. Understanding this principle separates those who endure from those who fail. It is not brilliance that produces wealth or stability. It is the consistent avoidance of predictable mistakes. David Tepper often emphasizes that leverage magnifies everything, both gains and losses. To wield leverage effectively, one must first understand risk and the limits of human behavior. Leverage is a double-edged sword. In finance, leverage can amplify returns, but it also amplifies mistakes. The same principle applies far beyond investing. Emotional, social, and operational leverage also magnify outcomes. Overcommitment in relationships, overextension in business, or overexposure to financial risk creates vulnerabilities that grow quietly over time. Most people underestimate how quickly these small errors compound. It is rarely a single catastrophic event that destroys someone's financial position or reputation. It is a series of minor lapses, repeated and left uncorrected, that quietly erode resilience. In contrast, small disciplined advantages, protected and nurtured, compound quietly. Saving consistently, avoiding unnecessary debt, maintaining discretion, and acting within one's circle of competence may appear insignificant in the short term, but over decades they produce disproportionate results. It is the power of compounding in both directions. The difference between success and failure is rarely genius. It is discipline. It is the cumulative effect of small, thoughtful choices. Human behavior is predictable, and this predictability can be leveraged. Many failures occur not because people are unintelligent, but because they misunderstand the forces that shape behavior over time. Excessive confidence, impatience, envy, and the inability to admit mistakes are recurring sources of error. These flaws magnify when combined with leverage. The intelligent person is not immune. In fact, intelligence can exacerbate risk because clever reasoning often justifies poor decisions. Without discipline and humility, brilliance alone is insufficient to preserve wealth, relationships, or opportunity. The principle of inversion is critical. Instead of asking, "How do I succeed?" ask, "How do people reliably fail?" The answers are remarkably consistent: excessive leverage, uncontrolled ego, impatience, envy, poor alignment of incentives, and failure to respect time and compounding. Avoiding these pitfalls positions an individual ahead of most of the population, even without extraordinary intelligence. Avoiding stupidity consistently is the real path to durable success. Risk management begins with understanding where exposure exists. Financial risk is the most obvious, but there are social, operational, and psychological forms as well. Revealing plans too early, giving away leverage in negotiations, or committing to outcomes without optionality all create risk. Discretion is a form of insurance. Privacy is a form of hedging. Timing is a risk control mechanism. The disciplined individual approaches decisions systematically, understanding that the consequences of minor lapses are amplified over time. Consider the compounding nature of errors. A minor misstep, say, announcing an intent prematurely or over-leveraging a position, might seem inconsequential initially, yet each subsequent interaction, each market shift, and each reaction from others magnifies that misstep. Before long, what appeared trivial becomes irreversible. This principle applies not only to finance, but to relationships, careers, and personal development. Small errors left uncorrected compound quietly into life-altering outcomes. Conversely, small, prudent actions, saving consistently, exercising restraint, maintaining privacy, also compound, creating structural advantages that grow exponentially with time. Leverage, when combined with impatience or ego, is particularly dangerous. Overconfidence encourages action before the optimal moment. Impatience leads to commitments without full information. Ego drives public declarations and attempts to impress. Each magnifies the consequences of small errors. The disciplined individual exercises restraint, waits for clarity, and only acts when the advantage is clear. As Tepper would observe, patience is a form of intelligence, and timing is leverage in itself. Waiting when nothing actionable can be done is often the highest return decision. Another often overlooked aspect of risk is emotional leverage. Relationships, authority, and trust are all forms of leverage that can magnify success or failure. Giving too much trust to someone without aligned incentives, sharing vulnerabilities with those unequipped to handle them, or committing to relationships prematurely can erode optionality. Once lost, it is extremely difficult to regain. Emotional and social leverage must be managed with the same rigor as financial leverage. Strategic restraint preserves long-term advantages. Time is the ultimate amplifier. It magnifies both error and prudence. A minor lapse compounded over years can undo decades of careful effort. Conversely, a small, repeated advantage accumulates quietly until it becomes decisive. Life rewards patience, durability, and consistency far more than flashiness, cleverness, or ego-driven action. Those who understand this principle act deliberately, maintain discipline, and resist the temptation to overreach. In financial markets, this principle is particularly visible. Investors who chase momentum over leverage or speculate aggressively often suffer catastrophic outcomes. Meanwhile, those who focus on preservation, risk management, and compounding over time consistently outperform. The market punishes impatience and rewards restraint. The same pattern emerges in business and personal life. Decisions made under duress, without privacy, or with misaligned incentives almost always compound negatively. Decisions made with discipline, optionality, and awareness of compounding almost always compound positively. Leverage then is neutral. It magnifies whatever it touches. Used wisely, it accelerates growth and creates optionality. Used carelessly, it accelerates destruction. The lesson is universal: minimize unnecessary leverage, protect options, and respect the compounding nature of both error and advantage. Financial, emotional, and operational leverage all obey the same rules. Understanding this allows one to navigate risk effectively over a lifetime. David Tepper emphasizes the importance of structural advantage over individual brilliance. The disciplined individual does not rely on extraordinary talent to survive or prosper. Instead, they preserve optionality, control information, align incentives, and respect the power of compounding. Each choice, each restraint, each moment of patience builds structural advantage that is nearly invisible in the short term, but decisive over decades. It is the accumulation of thousands of small, disciplined actions that produces resilience, wealth, and freedom. Ultimately, success is rarely dramatic. It is the quiet result of avoiding obvious errors, managing leverage carefully, respecting incentives, and preserving optionality. Avoiding failure is often more important than chasing brilliance. Time amplifies every decision, small and large. The disciplined individual understands this and structures their life to benefit from it. The impatient, the overconfident, and the careless surrender to compounding consequences they cannot control. The takeaway is clear: leverage magnifies, errors compound, patience accumulates advantages, and disciplined restraint preserves optionality. Understanding these principles separates those who endure and prosper from those who falter. Financial, social, and personal leverage all obey the same rules. Apply them deliberately, protect them vigilantly, and let the quiet compounding of small advantages carry you forward. If there is one principle that underpins all the lessons I have shared over decades of observing human behavior and financial markets, it is this: a well-lived life is the product of disciplined avoidance of folly, patient accumulation of advantage, and careful alignment with predictable human behavior. Nothing in life is more permanent than the consequences of a single lapse in judgment. Every decision, every disclosure, every moment of impatience carries weight far beyond its immediate appearance. David Tepper often emphasizes that success is not about brilliance or heroics. It is about durability, patience, and the quiet accumulation of small advantages over time. Avoiding obvious mistakes is more important than seeking flashes of genius. People often assume that extraordinary intelligence or clever insight is the key to success. Yet, in my observation, many of the most intelligent individuals fail because they are overconfident, impatient, or prone to rationalizing errors with elaborate reasoning. Brilliance alone does not protect you from compounding mistakes. Avoiding stupidity consistently produces more reliable outcomes than striving to be the cleverest person in the room. The lessons are simple but often overlooked. Do not over-leverage, respect incentives, protect optionality, and act only when circumstances favor success. Time is the ultimate ally of the disciplined. Compounding works quietly but relentlessly. Small advantages, consistently maintained, grow into extraordinary outcomes. Conversely, small lapses repeated or left uncorrected compound into major failures. The difference between those who thrive and those who falter is rarely genius. It is discipline. It is the ability to stay in the game, preserve control, and let the compounding of prudent choices work over decades. Acting prematurely, overextending oneself, or misjudging incentives accelerates failure. Patience, however, allows opportunities to unfold, risks to be mitigated, and advantages to accumulate quietly. Privacy and strategic restraint are key pillars of durable success. Premature disclosure of intentions, vulnerabilities, or financial positions removes leverage and optionality. People adjust their behavior in predictable ways when they know your plans. This is not malice. It is human nature responding to incentives. Those who understand this act deliberately, controlling the flow of information and timing of action. Strategic restraint is not secrecy for its own sake. It is the recognition that flexibility, control, and discretion are among the most valuable assets one can maintain. Incentives, rather than intentions, drive behavior. Most disappointment and misaligned outcomes occur because people assume others will act as they would out of fairness, kindness, or loyalty. Reality is far more predictable. Humans act according to incentives, align incentives wherever possible. Do not rely solely on trust or goodwill. Systems, agreements, and structures should be designed so that ordinary behavior produces acceptable outcomes. This principle applies across personal, professional, and financial domains. Trust without aligned incentives is fragile. Proper alignment is durable. Resentment and emotional mismanagement are also quietly destructive. Words spoken impulsively, grievances expressed without reflection, and vulnerabilities revealed without care often have long-term consequences. Relationships, reputations, and opportunities can be irreparably damaged by minor emotional miscalculations compounded over time. Emotional discipline is as critical as financial discipline. Patience in speech, measured disclosure, and deliberate interaction preserve optionality and long-term advantage. The disciplined individual exercises patience in action. They understand the difference between activity and progress. Many people mistake constant motion for achievement. Meetings, discussions, and busy work often masquerade as effectiveness. True success comes from acting when conditions are favorable, waiting when nothing intelligent can be done, and avoiding the compounding consequences of rash decisions. In investing, business, and life, inaction at the right time is often the highest return decision. Impulsive cleverness without discipline erodes optionality, increases risk, and magnifies mistakes. Leverage magnifies everything it touches. In finance, emotional dynamics, relationships, or operations, overexposure amplifies both gains and losses. The prudent individual respects leverage, both tangible and intangible. Financially, this means avoiding excessive debt or concentrated risk. Socially, it means aligning incentives and protecting relationships. Operationally, it means designing systems that prevent reliance on extraordinary behavior from others. The unwise overextend in all three domains, and compounding magnifies the consequences. The disciplined preserve leverage, maintain optionality, and act deliberately. Comparison and envy are subtle but destructive forces. Revealing financial success, career progress, or personal achievements often invites envy, altered expectation, or dysfunctional dynamics. Money is a status signal, not just a medium of exchange. Sharing it prematurely distorts relationships and interactions. Families fracture, teams lose focus, and friendships are strained. Prudence in disclosure, discretion in sharing, and patience in communication preserve stability and minimize unnecessary emotional or social risk. Avoiding comparison is not arrogance. It is recognition of human psychology and the compounding risks of misaligned incentives. Finally, long-term success is built on quiet, cumulative advantages rather than visible heroics. Life rewards durability, adaptability, and patient accumulation of small, prudent choices. Those who focus on cleverness often underestimate the structural risks around them and overestimate the power of intelligence alone. Those who respect predictable human behavior, preserve privacy, maintain leverage, align incentives, and act with restraint build advantages that are almost invisible in the short term but decisive over decades. Small, consistent decisions produce a resilient life that functions extraordinarily well from within, even if it appears unremarkable externally. The essence of a well-lived life, financial or personal, is avoidance of folly. Avoiding predictable errors, protecting optionality, respecting incentives, exercising restraint, and allowing time to amplify prudence forms the foundation of durability. Brilliance may accelerate success temporarily, but it cannot substitute for the compounding effects of discipline. David Tepper often highlights that patience, flexibility, and structural advantage are the most reliable paths to sustainable outcomes. The accumulation of these quiet, deliberate actions produces results far more enduring than flashy or impulsive brilliance. In conclusion, every choice carries consequences, and every disclosure, every commitment, and every action interacts with human behavior, incentives, and time. Avoid obvious mistakes. Preserve optionality. Control the flow of information. Respect incentives. Exercise restraint. Be patient. Let small advantages compound quietly. Avoid rash action and premature disclosure. Understand that leverage magnifies both gains and losses. Protect it carefully. Recognize that comparison, envy, and misaligned incentives distort relationships. Align structures wherever possible. Allow time to do its work. A successful life is rarely dramatic. It is measured, patient, and deliberate. It accumulates advantages quietly, preserves flexibility, and avoids predictable errors. Brilliance is overrated. Discipline is undervalued. Patience is powerful. Optionality is precious. Privacy is protective. Time amplifies all decisions, good and bad. Those who understand and apply these principles accumulate structural advantages that are decisive over decades. Avoiding folly is not glamorous, but it is the foundation of resilience, wealth, freedom, and a well-lived life. If you remember nothing else, remember this: your future depends on your ability to control information, align incentives, protect optionality, and consistently avoid obvious errors. Nothing in life is more permanent than the consequences of a single lapse in judgment. Guard your decisions, your resources, your information, and your security. Act with discipline, patience, and foresight. Let the quiet compounding of prudence and restraint carry you forward over a lifetime. That is the path to enduring success, stability, and freedom.